Hey everybody, my name is James Furman. I'm the U.S. Forest Service Liaison for Department of Defense programs, funded partly by the Air Force Wildland Fire Branch and also by the Department of Defense's Environmental Research Program, and going to be talking about fire in the Deep South. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. The objectives, we'll look at how life cycles of fuels treatments differ in the Southeast as compared to Western states, and we'll talk about strategies for applying limited treatments to the landscape to meet multiple objectives. So things happen quickly in the Southeast, and fire frequency in a well-maintained stand is also going to happen frequently. In the coastal plain, some of the most fire-dependent ecosystems in the world, normal or natural fire frequencies of 1 to 3 years are common in places from the Everglades to the longleaf pine savannas and woodlands. Loss of fire results in really quick degradation. We have about an 11-month growing season and average anywhere from 40 to 60 plus inches of rain. So things change very rapidly, and it takes frequent fire to keep ecosystems healthy and to manage for biodiversity, threatened and endangered species, and other things we'll touch more on in the coming slides. So a little bit of history. Wallenberg, a famous ecologist that worked in the South, stated in 1946 there was a 12-month fire season in the South, and it's really true. We can have fires 12 months out of the year, and do have fires, both prescribed fires and wildfires. And even as early as 1911, it was stated it's only by chance that any area of unenclosed land escapes burning at least once in 2 years. A lot of interesting stories about even the early Spanish explorers when they were coming up to Florida and just seeing fire everywhere. One of many things that affects fire regimes in the Southeast as compared to the Western U.S., other parts of the country, is ownership patterns. And though I realize, especially the upper right-hand side of this slide may be a little hard to read, the take-home message is that there's a large percentage of private land ownership, both individuals as well as industry private land ownerships, and silviculture producing income is a key part of the activities that happen in these fire-prone ecosystems, and income from silvicultural activities in many cases on many ownerships actually helps fund conservation of biodiversity and other ecosystem related objectives. So definitely major differences in land ownership patterns in the Southeast as compared to many other parts of the country. In the Southeast, there's a long culture of fire. I mean, even during the early Smokey Bear era, there were folks that were still burning in the Southeast, and one of those pioneers in prescribed fire was a guy named Herbert Stoddard, who worked at Tall Timbers Research Station. And most of you have heard, I'm sure, of Aldo Leopold, but maybe haven't heard of Herbert Stoddard, but they were actually close friends. And this is an excerpt from a letter that Aldo Leopold was writing to a colleague. It says, "I've just spent several days with Stoddard and came away with the conviction that he has been too modest about the conservation methods he has worked out for the Southeast. They're commonly regarded as applicable only to game preserves, but in my opinion, he has developed principles which are equally applicable to lumber company holdings, national forest, and all other owners of coastal plain longleaf. It is a great satisfaction to me to know of your confidence in Stoddard. I, of course, am biased, for he is one of my closest personal friends. I am lecturing to my students Monday on the Stoddard method for handling southeastern pinelands." So as part of the culture of fire, for many people, smoke is considered just a nuisance in the Southeast. If you're in the southeastern coastal plain, most people grow up smelling smoke, and the prescribed fire councils are actually born and began in the Southeast. actually in Florida in particular, but spread from there. And most people in the Southeast understand that burning for wildlife is a good thing. Deer hunting, turkey hunting, quail hunting, etc., all benefit from maintaining the open fire maintained forest. I'm sure everyone in this class is familiar with fire-dependent ecosystems, and there are a wide range of different fire-dependent ecosystems in the Southeast, from the Everglades to Oak Hickory Forest. And for this particular presentation, I'm going to really be focusing in on longleaf pine ecosystem, which is a grass-dominated ecosystem where I spent much of my career. So the longleaf pine ecosystem is found in the southeastern coastal plain. Ecosystems are diverse and threatened. The longleaf pine ecosystem used to cover approximately 90 million acres, stretching from Virginia to eastern Texas, and there's only about 3 to 3.5 million acres of that left, so a very small percentage, and many rare, threatened, endangered, listed species that are found only in the longleaf pine ecosystem are drivers for a lot of the management, especially on public lands in the Southeast, but many of the private land holdings, especially those managed as game preserves and that sort of thing that have historically done a lot of burning, also have some of these high quality longleaf systems in place. So frequency is the most important aspect of the fire regime, and the average fire return intervals in a healthy longleaf pine system rarely exceed 5 years, and most require fire every 1 to 3 years, or they'll burn every 1 to 3 years to maintain a healthy system. And though there's an ongoing debate, or has been for years, regarding seasonality of burning as opposed to frequency, both have their place, but frequency kind of begets seasonality is the bottom line. So when you need to burn that frequently, you just have to burn when you have the opportunity, regardless of season, just for smoke management and all those other things that come into play. So we'll talk a little bit about restoring and managing longleaf systems. If a system is already degraded, especially if it has been fire excluded, fire alone may not be sufficient to restore the fuel structure and meet your biodiversity objectives. Certain deciduous or semi-deciduous hardwoods can come in and actually suppress fire activity and make it hard to reintroduce fire and regenerate that biodiversity in the ground cover that's so important for the system. So it's not uncommon to use mechanical or even chemical fuel treatments to alter the structure to facilitate restoration. So this is just one example on Eglin Air Force Base, the before and after. On these sand hills at Eglin Air Force Base, the longleaf pine system becomes encroached with sand pine in the absence of fire, and sand pine completely shades out the understory. So this is just a before and after picture where went in and harvested all the sand pine and left the longleaf to start the restoration process. Once sunlight can get to the forest floor, you can reintroduce fire, you can start stimulating the seed bank that's in there and start getting that more biodiverse system back in place. So let's talk a little bit about fuel treatment objectives. In western forests, fuel treatments are most commonly used to slow the spread of large wildfires or create areas of lower intensity fire, or to protect values or facilitate wildfire control, because wildfires are such a problem in the West. But in the South, fuel treatments are often used to restore frequent fire regimes. You actually go in there with the objective of doing the fuel treatment so that you can burn it. because fire is the key tool that prevents large wildfires, but also meets a wide variety of management objectives, particularly in these fire-dependent species or fire-dependent systems like the longleaf pine forest. So a number of different fuel treatments, nothing magic here, conventional harvest. There is a decent fuel wood market in parts of the Southeast, which is nice. Like for the previous example of removing the sand pine, most of that was sold for fuel wood. Also, herbicide, mechanical, and of course, prescribed fire, all as fuel treatment options. And these prices may be a little bit outdated. I'm a little less tuned into the management side of things than I used to be, but the bottom line is that prescribed fire is the cheapest method as far as if you're not producing income. But as mentioned previously, we do have biomass markets and also conventional harvest of hardwoods and or sand pine or even longleaf forest or longleaf pines. That may need to be thinning if you want to manage for a particular basal area. So this is an eye chart, and I realize that, but the take-home message here, the Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3 are different tiers of quality for the longleaf pine forest, specifically looking at the understory vegetation quality, and have 4 different treatments. One is a control, which is no treatment, burning only, thinning only, and thinning and burning. And the bottom line is that burning is almost always required to get to a tier 1 or tier 2, those higher ecosystem quality levels, as opposed to any of the other treatments. So burning is essentially always going to be required in these fire dependent systems, regardless of whatever other treatments that you may do. And that also includes herbicide. Even if you come in an herbicide, if you don't follow up with fire, you just don't get that response that you get with fire. So with regard to fuel treatment effectiveness, and this was actually done in the Piedmont, but it's pretty straightforward. Looking at those same control methods at your litter, your fine woody, and your large woody, and no real surprise that if you thin, you're going to generate more woody material as opposed to just burning. So again, take-home message here is that burning is almost always required for fuel treatment effectiveness in the Southeast. And repetitive burning, and part of that, as I mentioned previously, is because things grow back so quickly. So, do what you're going to do, but be sure and get fire on the ground as well. So, as mentioned, longevity fuel treatments is shortened in the Southeast due to the long growing season. Prescribed fire must be used to meet ecological objectives and maintain initial treatment effects. So in the Southeast, if you're managing for biodiversity, the goal of forestry is to promote the spread of low intensity frequent fire, as shown in the picture to the upper right. Production forestry, particularly pulpwood production, is an ineffective tool for managing risk of landscape fire. Many of you may be familiar with the bugaboo fire. That's a picture of it there in the center right. So we do have catastrophic wildfires, especially in these dense pulpwood stands that have not been burned. So long-term rotations growing for other products can be protected from catastrophic loss by frequent burning, and ecological objectives are met by maintaining a perpetual forest. So you can see some great examples of this in some of the quail preserves in the Red Hills area around Tallahassee and southeastern southern Georgia. Really, really beautiful privately owned lands there. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk now about Eglin Air Force Base, which is near and dear to my heart. I spent 15 years there managing the wildland fire program, but a really unique area. Also a very busy area. They have every branch of the services are there. I actually live about 15 miles as the crow flies from Eglin Air Force Base, and I can hear the bombing and things on quiet nights. So they stay busy, and they start a lot of wildfires, and also have an extremely active prescribed fire program, as we'll talk more about here in the coming slides. When I first arrived at Eglin Air Force Base to manage the wildland fire program back in 1998, it reminded me of the game of Risk. In particular, those of you that have played Risk should be able to relate to this. When you think you're doing good and you try to hold on to Asia, and you get everything spread out, and then all of a sudden somebody invades you from Alaska and Kamchatka, and you lose everything. You don't meet any of your objectives. You lose the game. That's kind of how I felt when I got to Eglin, but I'm going to talk about how we dealt with that in a way that really worked for us, and maybe hopefully there's some lessons learned that'll be applicable to some of the Western landscapes that some of you guys manage as well. So prior to 2001, the 30-year average for prescribed fire was about 38,000 acres a year at Eglin. And the directive when I got there in 1998 was to manage every acre at Eglin with fire. And you do the math, and it comes out like a 7 to 8 year rotation if you were able to do that. And that's just not sufficient on landscape like Eglin to manage for ecological reasons and threatening and endangered species. So, like trying to hold on to Asia in the Risk game, resources were spread too thin and few conservation objectives were being met. So we came up with a new approach, and targeted burning was needed to maintain the value of these highest priority areas. In other words, not spreading burn acres too thin and not maintaining frequency. We knew we had to maintain fire frequency. And so targeted burning makes priority areas easier to burn over time. And we'll talk a little more about that later in the slides. But easier burning increases burning capacity by widening prescription windows and increasing burn block size. So by really focusing on what we call core conservation areas and looking at the ecological drivers for fire, you can kind of build from the inside, similar to holding Australia and building out from there in the Risk game. So we developed a model to prioritize the limited fire resources we had to those areas where fire was most needed, and we'll cover that in a little more depth here. So we got scientists, managers, researchers together in workshops and identified the key factors at Eglin Air Force Base that determined the need to burn. And then for all of those that we could, and it was most of them, we developed GIS or remote sensing data layers that directly or indirectly represented those key factors. We weighted those factors by importance and then scored each as to how it should influence burning. So using manager's intuition as well as a decision support system, we iteratively modified the model, and we'd continue testing the model assumptions with monitoring. And we'll show the results here shortly. So here's a schematic of the model, and if you look on the far left-hand side of the slide, you can see the different layers that go into it, starting with sandpine encroachment at the top, going all the way down to riparian zones and seepage slopes at the bottom. And I realize it's, again, a bit of an eye chart, but I draw your attention to the red numbers and percentages, and that indicates the weight of each of these different layers in the model, and all of those are kind of mashed together, and you come out with an ecologically driven burn prioritization model. Landscape. So the first one we look at is fire history, and this is just a snapshot of fire history back in the early to mid 2000s at Eglin Air Force Base when we were developing the model. And if you look in the upper center part, you'll see the 0 to 20 scale, and the 20 is somewhat arbitrary. Don't get too hung up on that, but 20 is the maximum weight for this particular category. But if you look across the bottom, you'll see the 1, 4, 7, 10, 13, etc. That's the time since burn. And so the way that the weight works, whether this was, I don't remember if it's 8% of the model weight or whatever, at year 1, you don't get any priority at all. The year 2, it goes up, it peaks out at about year 7. From year 7 to about year 14, it gets the maximum weight. It's saying time since burn says you need to burn this area. But after that, at about year 14, it actually declines, because at that point, fire alone is not likely to be adequate for managing the sandpine and hardwood encroachment that has come in. So it starts losing priority for fire and increasing priority for some other type of treatment so that you can successfully reintroduce fire at a later date. So another thing we look at is fire frequency. How many fires has it seen in the last, and I think this was in the last 30 years. And so if it's seen many fires, it gets lower priority. But if it's only seen 1 fire or 3 fires or 5 fires in the last 30 years, it gets weight according to how many fires there had been during that time frame, because it ties directly into ecological quality, integrity, etc. Now this one's a little simpler. This is the management emphasis area for growing the red cockaded woodpecker population to 350 active clusters, I guess, or breeding groups. Anyway, 350 groups of red cockaded woodpeckers, and the yellow area outlined shows where the biologists and scientists said this is the area we need to focus on, because we've got old growth longleaf here, we've got potential to grow red cockaded woodpeckers. So unlike the previous ones, it's an all or nothing. If it falls within this area, it gets all of the weight associated with red cockaded woodpecker management. We also looked at land cover classification and favored those areas that are typical of longleaf pine uplands, sand hills, where fire frequency is common, to lower the priority of places like floodplain that have a very low fire frequency. So the results, you mash all these things together, all these different drivers for fire, and the first raw output that comes out is 30-meter scale. So it shows, the darker red areas here are the areas with the most drivers for fire, and the lighter areas have, less drivers for fire. And that's very interesting. It's important information, but it's not in this particular form something that can be easily used by managers. So what we did is we roll it up according to our actual burn management units. So the first management unit that we looked at is what we called secondary burn blocks. And secondary burn blocks on Eglin Air Force Base were any road or stream bounded polygon, as long as it had defensible streams or roads, streams that have traditionally held fire when fire has burned next to them, and roads. Any of these stream bound and road bound polygons greater than, I believe it was 30 or 40 acres, been a few years. So now all of a sudden you're looking at actual burn units. And these secondary units, though some of them are smaller than what we would typically burn, some days you can only burn small areas. And so that's the first roll up. But we also have our primary burn blocks, and these are the ones that are suitable for aerial ignition, which is how most of the acreage gets completed at Eglin Air Force Base. So you're looking at these aerial ignition units that are the highest priority on fire based on all of the manager, researcher, scientist input. And these blocks are easily defensible, and they range anywhere from 900 acres on up to some of them are more than 2,000 acres in size. So the actual burn map, and this is just a snapshot of one from back in 2012, includes primary and secondary burn blocks. And there's a reason for that. Again, sometimes you can only burn smaller burn blocks. The helicopter's broken, or due to smoke management concerns, or sometimes those secondary burn blocks that come up are very strategic and set you up for being able to burn on some of the primary burn blocks down the road. So it was just a nice way to balance out and increase our options. And an interesting point, we would always schedule and prioritize for a given year more than we thought we could possibly get done. So we would typically schedule anywhere from 130 to 145,000 acres for prescribed fire, knowing that we wouldn't get it all, but just to keep our options open for different wind directions, weather conditions, etc. So general principles. At Eglin Air Force Base, burning is paramount. If it's a burn day, we were going to burn somewhere, and we were going to burn by objectives and priority. Again, you see how the priority comes into play. If it's not on the map, it's not a priority. Another thing, and this surprises a lot of people, is there's no fixed return interval. The model tells us whether something needs to be burned or not. And if it's got all of the drivers, if it scores high on everything, it may come up for burning, every couple of years. And we actually, preferred to have a number of areas, these high priority areas, high ecological value, light roughs, 1 year roughs, where if it's, something of a red flag day where you couldn't burn safely somewhere else, you could go and reburn those areas and set the clock back on them. So having some of those areas with really light roughs that allowed you to burn on those marginal days was an important part of the strategy for really getting some acres accomplished. So again, things that came up on the burn map might be anywhere from a 1 year rough to a 7 to 8 to 10 year rough occasionally. But as you'll see later on, we actually got the fuels under control there. Another principle is, there are no perfect burns. We had to look at big picture burn regimes. If you're burning 2,000 or 3,000 acres in a day with a helicopter, there might be a hot spot here and there. There may be some canopy loss here and there. It may be a little damp in places where the burn's a little patchier than what you would have preferred. But it's better to get fire on the ground, and that's what the science was telling us. Burn. If you think you can burn and burn safely, get fire on the ground. And frequency leads to more frequency, and this is a phrase that was coined at Eglin, and that is, the more you can burn, the easier it is to burn, and the easier it is to burn, the more you can burn. And there's just so much truth to that, and there are a lot of things that feed into it, including not only you've got lighter roughs, but also, talk about your crew getting dialed in. When we were at our peak, burning, averaging over 100,000 acres a year, I guarantee you our burn crew was dialed. We were doing 100+ prescribed burns a year, so it was like clockwork. Folks knew exactly what to do. Everybody knew their role, and really, really a pleasure seeing how well that machine worked. Getting so much practice and understanding the area so well. So the results. In 1998, when I arrived there, the average time since burn in the core conservation area, which is the area that shows the colors in these two maps. And that equates, it's a little more than just the red cockaded woodpecker area, but it's essentially all the area that had that decent longleaf and ecological drivers for fire. But within that core conservation area in 1998, the average time since burn was 10.5 years. And by 2011, the average time since burn was 3.5 years. And I would add that it's, if you took out, you can see there are a few areas in the lower map that actually show gray, which is 10 plus. And some of those areas along the urban interface were almost unburnable. And if you took out those urban interface, and some of them are also very swampy, wouldn't carry much fire anyway. If you took those burn blocks out, the average time since burn is even less. I guess bottom line is, those areas didn't have as many ecological drivers as some of the others in the core conservation area. They didn't have the red cockaded woodpeckers, etc. So anyway, that's what happened over the course of that 13-year period. Greatly reduced the average time since burn in that core conservation area where we focused our efforts. So we measured success a number of different ways. Like any federal agency, we had ways to report our accomplishments, and it's pretty interesting. You look at the upper chart, and that's your annual prescribed fire acres and numbers of burns, and you can see that it's an upward trend. And actually, when I left there in 2012, we were averaging about 105,000 acres a year of prescribed fire, and a large number of burns. We were averaging close to 150 prescribed burns each year. But it's interesting, on the wildfires, the numbers of wildfires went down, but the acres of wildfires actually stayed about the same. And the reason for this is that once we got our fuels under control, when we had a wildfire, it was no longer, or very rarely was it, direct suppression. We would just back off to the nearest road, set counter fire, sometimes even call the helicopter in for some bonus acres. So a wildfire was no longer an emergency on a large part of the base, and we just had a lot more latitude with how we could manage those fires. We also measured success, rather, looking at red cockaded woodpecker recovery. And the red cockaded woodpecker, as many of you may be aware, it's a fire-dependent species, keystone species in the longleaf pine forest. Requires frequent fire for maintaining that grassy habitat that generates the insects that it feeds on. And once we got our burn program rolling, Eglin had the fastest growing red cockaded woodpecker population of any of the large land holdings within the red cockaded woodpeckers range. And we blew past the recovery goal, which was 350 active clusters. So great success story there, and it was directly tied. I mean, there was a lot of other work being done, but fire was key to getting those numbers up and gaining actually flexibility for the military mission. It was once the population was recovered, a lot of the restrictions to military activities were removed. So it was a big success story. So in addition to the prescribed fire prioritization model, we also had an ecological condition model that was developed, and it had a couple of submodels, the red cockaded woodpecker submodel and the fire submodel. Fire submodel included fire frequency, most frequent fire return interval, and other things rolled in together to give a good picture, scientifically based on the ecological condition of the forested lands on Eglin Air Force Base. And I'll show you some visuals on that. So this is a visual representation of ecological quality or ecological condition at Eglin Air Force Base in 1994. And what you're looking at, simple color coding, easy to remember. Blue is best, green is good, yellow is caution, and red or orange is poor or stop. So that's your best condition to your lowest condition. Again, blue's best, green good, yellow caution or degrading, and red is degraded. So we'll be looking at a time sequence going from 1994 through 2011. So moving forward, this is in 1999, and this is the year that we actually started using the burn prioritization model. So 1999, then we'll move forward in time. Notice how start focusing in those areas, the blue starts to increase, as does the green. You can see the chart that tracks the increase in the blue, and some of the green you see decreasing in the chart on the lower left, but that's because it's turning blue. So it's going from good to best. Again, moving forward in time with that focused burning approach, the core conservation area. So that's a result over that 15, 16 year period where we went from one to the other. So major improvement, obviously, in ecological condition. Now, I am not a statistician, but I have been told that this slide illustrates that fire frequency is the variable most strongly correlated with the high quality reference conditions of the longleaf pine forest on Eglin Air Force Base, and that a fire frequency of at least 5 years is required in order to maintain longleaf pine sandhills as high quality. If your fire return interval or fire frequency averages greater than 5 years, you will lose your high quality longleaf areas. So, adapting large scale burning. I mentioned burning more 1 year rough to increase patchiness and broaden prescription windows. That's something that was I guess a hard sell in the beginning, and of course a 1 year rough in many of your Western fuel types simply would not carry fires, so it might be a 3 or 4 year rough that you would maintain to have an area that you could just kind of set the clock back on. Also, burning small blocks within larger aerial ignition blocks in the year prior to aerial ignition. You remember we talked about the secondary blocks, and those coming in as high priority kind of automatically put some of these areas of shorter time since burn embedded within larger aerial ignition blocks that come up the next year. So not only does that provide refugia for wildlife, it also provides some heterogeneity in the burn and some of that patchiness, and accepting patchiness as an objective in burning. And that was another thing that was difficult for some of the managers at Eglin when I first got there and we started working on this, was they wanted it slick, clean, black when it was done, or they thought it was not a good burn. And we finally got beyond that patchiness can be a good thing, and it depends on your objectives, but especially if you've got these really nice light roughs, it's better to go out and burn it again. If you get 50 to 60 to 70% to carry, that's great. Those areas that didn't burn will have a longer rough next time that it comes up. So that's just some of the things that you get accustomed to when you're talking about large scale burn programs like this. And that is all I have. I wish I could be there in person, but I wish you all the best. And here's my contact information if you have specific questions about this presentation or just want to talk fire. Just give me a ring. Thank you. Bye.